we're back into the studio and we've gotten a lot of shots on this project. Let's take a look at a few of them and discuss how aperture played a role. We're going to talk about aperture in the broad sense here. More open, shut down, dial down. Don't worry about the exact numbers because the exact numbers are meaningless. If you have a crop sensor, the lighting conditions change.
It's totally situational, right? Like we can't give you a recipe that says, oh, when you're outside, shoot at this f-stop at this ISO. It's really going to depend on what's going on in the environment, what you're trying to achieve for the look. So just be a little, what is that phrase? Have situational awareness when it comes to the exposure triangle and things like aperture.
All right, so let's look at a couple of shots here. We are on the road, and you were actually the focus puller on this shot, and we're seeing him play. Let's just take this up, and we'll go temporarily full screen. And what I see is that our subject is clearly in focus from the back of the guitar all the way to the front, but the trees and the leaves aren't very distracting.
No, and this was a situation where we were adjusting aperture for two reasons, the aesthetic reason, but also to keep the exposure in a good place. We didn't want to go to too low of an aperture like 2.8 or 3.5 or something like that. Otherwise, you'd have to put a lot of ND on the lens, that kind of stuff. And if memory serves, Rich, we were somewhere right around f8 or so on this, and this was giving us a lot of stuff that was nice and sharp and in focus. But that background was ever so slightly blurry, but nowhere near what it would be if we had a really wide aperture. And that was perfect for this shot because we didn't want it to look, totally surreal, but it kept us nice and sharp focus with the artist Jason there, and kept everything else also in pretty nice focus.
All right, our next shot here, we're moving into the car, and we needed to use aperture because there was not a lot of light in the car. We added light, we've talked about this, but we wanted to have enough light so things are coming out, and we didn't need to be able to read the whole page, right?
Right, totally. And in this situation, we were shooting at about 1.8 or so, and we were using the, the fill lights that we had from some of those nice portable lights to get more of a focused effect on the actual paper there. But this was really an aesthetic choice. So I think we could have probably gone with a little higher f-stop. We could have probably gone down to, 2.8 or something like that. But the reason I really like this is because we have that nice background blur and it gives it a nice aesthetic feel. So sometimes, again, it's a combination between technical reasons why you're adjusting aperture, but then also aesthetic reasons.
Now, our next shot here is an interesting one. We're really open here so that the back of the guitar and the strings are in focus, but the further hand, the frets are out of focus. But in order to pull this off, we had to make a change in our shooting with some hardware, right?
Well, yeah, we actually had to do two things. We had to actually lower the ISO on the camera itself to probably near its lowest sensitivity because it was pretty bright out there. And then we had to use some neutral density filters on the actual lens to be able to cut down on the amount of incoming light into the camera. Because we wanted to have this nice sort of soft background there, but if we had shot without a neutral density, guess what? It would have been blown out and overexposed. So that's another thing to consider when you're adjusting aperture. If you want to get that nice soft background blur, especially when you're in a brighter situation, you're definitely going to have to consider using either screw-on type neutral density filters or a matte box with slide-in neutral density filters.
And what we have happening here is, while the clouds aren't pronounced with this soft focus, I can actually see the cloud detail versus the sky detail, which means that it's a good overall exposure. We had to find that happy middle ground.
Absolutely.
All right, so here we're back into the nightclub. We're getting ready. This is the jib shot, and the camera's moving around. In this case, we had plenty of light to work with, but we actually chose to put the f-stop smaller. We went, probably around somewhere in the 16 range, and why is that?
Well, here's the thing, is that this camera was actually up on a jib, and when you're shooting with a lower f-stop number, 2.8, 3.5, so on and so forth, obviously, we discussed this before, focus becomes kind of an issue because of that really shallow depth of field. And it would be kind of a pain unless you had a remote focusing system to get up there on the jib and adjust focus. So shooting at that larger f-stop, the higher number, 12, 15, 16 or whatever, is going to allow us to make nice movements while keeping everything in focus.
Yeah, what's nice here is the performer never goes out of focus, and the camera is able to swoop in and really get emotional and then pull back and reveal the whole stage.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this, though, we did actually have to, because we were shooting at that, the eye was, stepped down, and we're letting less light into the camera, we actually did have to boost the light out on the scene quite a bit, and we did also stop up the ISO a little bit so the camera was a little bit more sensitive because less light was coming in.
But the good news was this was shot on the 5D Mark III, and we decided to put the camera that had the best high ISO performance for this shot. And that was the newest camera. And as we're seeing, ISOs are getting cleaner. None of these shots we're showing you now have been post-processed. This is straight out of the camera. So we can obviously do more in post, but we want you to see those shots. Now, this was my camera angle from the music video, and I was shooting very shallow. I was probably in the, I'd say 3.2 range here. And as you look at that from the side, look at the backdrop.
Yeah, it's really nice, and especially for this type of shot, where you have that jib shot that's nice and in focus. We wanted to be some of these cutaway angles, be a little bit more creative, a little more soft, and I think you achieved that just well. I mean, you were shooting pretty wide open, and because of that, you could step down your ISO to a lower sensitivity. And again, your shutter speed for all of these shots was pretty much fixed. We were right around a 50th because we were shooting at 24 frames a second, and I think you accomplished a nice looking shot here.
Yeah, I like that the hair has detail, but we can actually see a little bit of stubble on the cheek. It gives him that edge. But the backdrop of the wood and the beams and the brick just sort of simplifies out the color. Now, you were doing a similar shot from the other side, and you were getting the guitar and the strings and that action. Let's just roll forward there, and we'll get past the slate there. There we go.
It's always good to slate.
Yep. And so now you were able to get it. I mean, this is perfect, right? We have one shoe in focus, one shoe out of focus.
Yeah, and I find especially on music videos where you're trying to give sort of a feeling, an emotive feel to things, I'm not so worried about, hey, you know, he's moving and it slightly went out of focus for a moment there. I'm more about the overall look. And you'll see right there his face goes slightly soft as he's moving around. And I actually wasn't really worried about adjusting focus. I kind of just locked in, I zoomed in, kind of locked in onto the guitar, and then let the scene kind of develop.
Now, here we go to another classic situation, which is the interview. And this was important, right? We're at a club, and we had limited choices for the backdrops. And what I wanted here, let's just be honest, is I wanted you to focus on the performer. Now, we took a seat at the bar in this cafe, and there was lots of color, but the last thing I wanted people doing was sitting there going, I've drunk that beer, I've had that one, I've had that one. We just wanted the sea of color behind him, but we didn't want it to be distracting. So we're using the aperture, and we actually pulled him closer to the camera so he was further away so that stuff would fall out.
Yeah, and you know, back in the day with smaller chip video cameras, to get the same type of effect, you used to have to place the camera on one side of the room, the subject on the other side of the room, use a telephoto lens, and then cross your fingers that you'd have some nice depth of field. But now, obviously, with the larger sensor sizes and the fast lenses that are available on these DSLRs, we can accomplish that in relatively close space. And I think, yeah, this is a perfect look, especially for interviews that are more stylistic. I would say news interviews, it's okay if you have things in the background kind of there, but this gives it a nice soft feel. And I also like kind of how some of the highlights flare out a little bit and stuff, and it looks pretty good.
Oh, what I struggled with here, and I look at this shot, was what to do with the right-hand edge. We were in a situation where if I panned over to the left, I was going to get too much distraction. There were some people working over there. The side on the right was left open. I figured we're going to put some identification information in there occasionally. I left some room, so if we want to drop in a picture-in-picture effect or a split-screen effect.
You could even push into the shot a little bit and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And again, this is a case, again, where we were doing this interview relatively quickly, and I like the way that the background looks. I think you could argue maybe his shirt's a little, crushed and that kind of stuff, but this is a perfect situation. Again, you've said this multiple times over the past few episodes, that you got to kind of pick the middle situation, or you're going to spend too much time in the set, wasting time actually, trying to get it perfect. And this is a perfect example where we got the main component that we want of the depth of field in the shot, but we can come back later and post, pick those blacks up a little bit, maybe add a little saturation to his face, that kind of thing. And this is a perfect shot to get started with.
All right, well, you've seen aperture put into action as well as gotten the DP's perspective. Hopefully this gives you some more ideas on how these all fit together. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to take a look at the other sides of the triangle, which is going to be shutter speed and ISO.